Washington Irving was one of the first American novelists to be treated as a literary artist both at home and abroad. His story, written in 1907, is often interpreted as a meditation on the way Americans relate to the problem of history in a land of new beginnings. The first explicit reference to history in Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle occurs right at the beginning of the story. Irving claims that this story is not in fact the product of his own imagination, but is instead a story found in the effects of a historian who had passed away. According to Irving, this historian had done scrupulous research on the history of the early Dutch colonists who had settled New York early in its history. The historian and his story, we are told by Irving, are reliable and trustworthy. We might ask ourselves why Irving chose to present his fictional story as if it was fact. At the beginning of our story, we learn that Rip Van Winkle was a very popular figure in his small town in colonial New York. He was born in the days when New York was a colony under the rule of England and King George. Though Dutch by family origin, Van Winkle was loyal subject to the king. Rip Van Winkle was popular with everyone because he was always willing to help his neighbors, even with the smallest task. He would carry the children about, mend their kites, and play games with them. He was also popular at the local pub, where he would get together with his friends and philosophize for hours about the state of the world and the meaning of life. Van Winkle's wife, however, was not so pleased with him. She disliked the fact that he was always willing to help anyone else with their work, but that he refused to work on his own family farm. His children would run wild and were not taken care of. In response to his behavior, Rip's wife would nag him endlessly, but to no avail. In response to the nagging, Rip would often take his gun and his trusty dog named Wolf and wander through the woods of the Catskill Mountains looking for squirrels to hunt. On one such day, he wandered far outside the town and sat down on a hill in the mountains. After relaxing for a few minutes, he was surprised to see a small figure laboring up the hill. The figure was dressed in the antique Dutch clothing that Van Winkle's own ancestors might have worn many years in the past. The figure was struggling under the weight of a large keg of liquor. Rip was surprised when the stranger called him by name, but being a kind person, Rip Van Winkle offered to help the man carry his burden and went with him farther into the hills. After a time, they came on a ravine between two mountains. In the ravine, several figures, dressed in the old Dutch style, played the game of ninepins, a traditional Dutch game not unlike bowling. The men, who remained silent as they played, motioned to Rip to pour them drinks from the keg. Rip did so, but seeing them drink made him thirsty as well. He soon helped himself to a good deal of the drink. The next thing Rip knew, he woke up back on the grassy hill where he had fallen asleep. He was surprised to find that someone had taken his gun and replaced it with another gun that was rusted and unusable. When he called for his dog, the dog did not appear. As he walked back to town, he noticed that when people looked at him, they touched their chins. When he touched his own, he realized that he had grown a large beard. When he got back to town, everything had changed. His house, already in ill repair, was now in shambles. None of his old friends could be found. He thought he saw his dog, but the dog did not recognize him. He wandered over to the pub, where he used to spend so much of his time, and he found that the picture of King George had been replaced with a picture of someone called General George Washington. In the pub, people started to gather around him and ask him questions. It was voting day, and when the people at the pub asked him who he was voting for, he said that he was a loyal subject of King George. This made the people very angry, and several of them wanted to fight with the old man. Soon it was discovered that Rip had actually been asleep for 20 years after taking the magical drink. The dog he had encountered was in fact his son's dog. His son, also named Rip, had grown up just like him. Many of Rip's friends had died in the Revolutionary War as the American colonists fought for independence. There were now elections for a president, and there was no longer a king. Rip never fully adjusted to life in the modern era. He was lost on contemporary politics, and he spent most of his time hanging out with the young people and telling them his story. Eventually, everyone in the region heard Rip's story, and although he spent all his time doing what he pleased, and contemporary issues were lost on him, he became a bit of a celebrity in his parts, and no one expected a person his age to be involved with work and politics anyhow. In the next assignment found in this module, I want you to consider 4 of the places where the notion of history comes into this story. I want you to think about 4 aspects of history in particular. The first, think about the background story and the false history of the historical validity of the fictional story created by Washington Irving. Second, think about the old Dutch figures who seem to be out of the past of Dutch history. Third, think about Rip Van Winkle's own loss of history as he slept for 20 years. Finally, think about the modern colonists and the way they react to Rip when he returns to town. And specifically, I want you to ask yourselves, how might we interpret this story as an allegory or analogy for the way Americans as a whole deal with history?